Hi everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today we're diving into James and Diep's story. Just when Nye asks one innocent question, everything starts to crack. And then Fat receives a chilling text. Don't play the hero. If you're curious who's watching them and what happens next, stay with me. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Nye tilted her head, thinking so hard her little brows almost touched. So, if you and James don't find a solution, she said, slowly, like she was solving a school problem, does that mean you're not good kids anymore? Diep froze for half a second, just long enough for her smile to wobble. Then she crouched to Nye's level, smoothing a stray strand of hair behind the girl's ear like the question was nothing. Like it didn't land right on the sorest part of her chest. Hey, Diep said gently, voice light on purpose. Adults and kids are different. Nye blinked. Different how? Diep let out a soft laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to keep something from spilling out. When kids argue, she explained, you can be mad for, what? 2 minutes? Then you forget because someone offers candy, or you see a cat, or you just get tired of being angry. Nye's eyes widened. That's true. But adults, Diep continued, adults can be upset for a long time. Sometimes we're upset and we don't even know how to stop. Nye looked at her like that was the strangest thing she'd ever heard. Why would you do that? Diep's fingers tightened around the edge of the kitchen counter. The kitchen was warm, steam from the kettle, the sweet smell of vanilla, the quiet hum of a fan overhead. Everything in the room felt soft, safe, ordinary. And yet her heart didn't feel ordinary at all. Because adults have more things in their head, Diep said. More worries, more responsibilities, and sometimes more pride. Nye frowned even harder, clearly unconvinced. But if you're sad, you can just cry, right? Then it goes away. Diep's smile thinned, but she nodded like she agreed. Sometimes, yes. Nye scooted closer, whispering like she was sharing a secret. Wow, when I'm sad, I cry all day, and then the next day I'm okay again. Diep swallowed. That simple, innocent truth hit too close, like a finger pressing a bruise you've been pretending isn't there. That's nice, Diep said softly. Nye stared at her face. Do you cry all day too? Diep shook her head quickly. Not really. Why not? Diep didn't answer right away. She kept her hands busy instead, reaching for a spoon, tapping flour off the table, wiping an invisible spot on the counter. Busy hands. A quiet trick to hide a noisy heart. When adults cry, she said carefully, it's different. Different again? Nye sounded almost offended. Why is everything different? Diep forced herself to keep the same calm tone. Because when I'm sad, I don't cry all day. I might not cry at all, but the sadness can stay for a long time. How long? Diep stared at the cake on the table, the frosting half spread, the edges messy in a way that should have been cute. A week, she admitted. Sometimes longer. Nye's mouth fell open. A whole week? That's so complicated. Diep gave a little shrug, like it was a casual fact and not the truth she'd been carrying around like a stone. Yeah, adults are complicated. Nye crossed her arms dramatically. Then I don't want to grow up. Diep laughed. This time, it sounded real, because it was something she could hold on to without bleeding. Fair choice. Nye leaned in, still serious. So, what do we do? If you and James don't find a solution, then... Diep cut her off gently, touching Nye's shoulder. We'll talk about it later, okay? But right now, Diep said, turning the girl toward the table, we have something very important to do. Nye's attention snapped to the cake. The cake. Yes, Diep said, grateful for the distraction. We need to check it. 'Cause someone told me she's in charge of quality control. Nye straightened up proudly. That's me. Diep handed her a small spoon. One tiny taste. Only for science. Nye giggled, scooping a bit of frosting and tasting it like a professional chef. It's good. Diep nodded, pretending to focus on the frosting, on the easy warmth of the moment. But inside, Nye's words kept echoing. If you don't find a solution, you're not good kids anymore. It wasn't even an accusation. It was just a child's logic, simple and clean and cruel in the way innocence can be. And it forced Diep to look at her own pain without the adult excuses she'd been hiding behind. Kids fight and forgive fast. Kids cry and recover fast. Adults don't. Diep didn't want to admit how much she missed James. She didn't want to admit how every quiet moment in the house sounded louder because he wasn't there. She didn't want to admit how she replayed their last conversations like a loop she couldn't stop, searching for the exact second things broke. And yet, watching Nye lick frosting off the spoon with carefree joy, Diep felt the contrast so sharply it almost made her dizzy. Outside, life was complicated. Inside this kitchen, everything was supposed to be simple. This small routine, cake, laughter, a child's bright eyes, was the only thing holding her together. For one tiny second, a faint hope flickered. Not because things were fixed, not because the problem was gone, but because Nye was here. Because love, real love, still existed in small acts and patient explanations and quiet care. Then the heaviness returned, creeping back in. James was still gone. The silence between them was still growing. Talk later didn't solve anything. It only delayed the moment the truth would break through. Diep kept smiling anyway, kept teaching anyway, kept moving through the routine like routine could protect her from what she was feeling. She even glanced at her phone once, then twice. No new message, no missed call. She told herself he'd explain soon. She told herself not to hope too loudly. But the wound was there, and Nye, without meaning to, had touched it perfectly. Later that day, James drove to Pat's house with a bag of fruit in the passenger seat. Apples, oranges, a bunch of bananas tied together like he'd grabbed whatever looked healthy and familiar. Fat opened the door and raised an eyebrow. You showing up like this? People are going to think you did something wrong. James stepped inside, setting the fruit down on the table. Maybe I did. Fat snorted, but his eyes softened. Sit. They sat close, not in a dramatic way, just in the way two men sit when they don't have the energy for distance. The room felt quiet, lived in, no fancy decorations. Just the kind of home that held real life. Fat poured tea, pushing a cup toward James. My mom said to thank you again. James nodded. She's okay? She's okay, Fat said. Then he paused. You didn't have to give that much money. James shrugged. I wasn't giving it to you. Oh? Fat leaned back. Who was it for then? James didn't smile. He stared at the tea like the answer was sitting at the bottom of the cup. It was for your mom, he said quietly. She needed it. Fat exhaled, like he didn't know whether to feel grateful or annoyed. You're ridiculous. James didn't argue. The silence stretched, and in that silence Fat could see it. The tension in James's jaw, the way his fingers kept tightening around the cup. Fat's voice lowered. You look like someone put a mountain on your back. James gave a humorless laugh. Feels heavier than a mountain. Fat watched him for a moment. So, are you still doing it? James's eyes flicked up. Doing what? Don't play dumb, Fat said. The evidence, the whole sending your dad to prison thing. James's shoulders stiffened, At first, he'd sounded so sure, like the decision was clean, like justice could be packaged into a folder and delivered. But now, sitting here with a friend who knew him too well, James felt the truth pressed down on him. This wasn't just a villain he was fighting, it was his father. James rubbed his thumb along the edge of the cup. I don't know. Fat's expression shifted. You don't know? James exhaled slowly, like he'd been holding that breath for days. I thought I did. I really thought I did. But then your mom, Fat guessed. James didn't answer, and that was answer enough. I know what's right, James said, voice tight. I know what he's done. I know who gets hurt if I do nothing. His fingers clenched around the cup. But it's not that simple. It's my father. Fat's face softened again, but his eyes stayed sharp. That's the chain, huh? James swallowed. It did feel like a chain, something invisible that still yanked every time he tried to step away. Fat continued, calmer now. Then talk to him directly. Ask him why he hates Diep so much. James's jaw tightened. I tried, many times. And? No reaction. Not lately, James said. It's like he doesn't even hear me anymore. Fat sighed. Then confront him. Make him answer. James stared at the floor, the thought both terrifying and tempting. Somewhere deep down, beneath all the anger and fear, there was still a part of him that wanted an answer. Not an excuse, not a lie, just the truth. And right behind that came the guilt. Because what kind of son drags his own father into court, even when he deserves it? Fat's voice steadied. Okay, tell me everything. Start from the part you've been avoiding. James closed his eyes for a second. Then he opened them, and his voice dropped into something sharp and urgent. My father is targeting Diep's company. Fat's expression hardened immediately. How? I don't know every detail yet, James admitted, but I know enough to be scared. He's planning something that could ruin her, and if it ruins her company, it ruins her life. Fat didn't joke now. What do you need from me? James leaned forward, eyes intense. I need you to watch him. Monitor whatever you can. If he makes a move, any move, you tell me. And if you can stop it, he hesitated, like asking was admitting weakness. Stop it. Fat stared at him. You're serious. I've never been more serious, James said. Fat nodded once. Fine, I'll handle it. James's shoulders loosened a fraction, like a rope around his chest had eased, just a little. But it wasn't relief. It was desperation, finding a temporary place to rest. Then James said the next part, quieter. And I need you to meet Diep. Fat blinked. Me? Yes. James's voice tightened. Warn her. Tell her to be careful. Why aren't you telling her? Fat demanded. James's face flickered. Pain. Guilt. Something deeper. Because I can't. Fat's eyes narrowed. Can't or won't. James swallowed hard. Can't. Fat leaned back, studying him. James, she needs you by her side right now. James flinched like he'd been slapped. I know, he whispered. Then why are you walking away? James stared at the fruit on the table, bright and untouched, like a small offering that couldn't buy forgiveness. His voice came out rough. Because if I stay close, she gets dragged into something I can't handle. Fat frowned. What does that even mean? It means... James's throat tightened. I'd rather let her misunderstand than watch her get hurt because of me. Fat didn't reply right away. The quiet between them was heavy, filled with everything James wasn't saying. Finally, Fat exhaled. You're choosing to protect her from afar. James nodded, eyes fixed somewhere distant. It's the only way I can think of. Fat's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue anymore. He just said, "Call me, don't disappear." "I will," James promised, "whenever it's safe." He stood up, leaving the fruit behind. He paused at the door, looking back one last time, like he wanted to say more, like he wanted to be stopped. But he didn't ask, and Fat didn't stop him. James walked out. The air outside felt colder than it should have. He got into his car, started the engine, and drove away with a tightness in his chest that didn't ease. Inside the house, Fat stared at the closed door for a moment, still processing what James had just put in his hands. Then, his phone vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. "Don't play the hero." Fat's face went still. He walked to the window, and that's when he saw it. A car parked down the street, sitting there like it had been there for a long time. Not moving, not accidental. Fat's grip tightened around the phone. If they were watching him, then how close were they already to Diep?
Ở nhà, Diệp cố gắng giữ cuộc sống bình lặng trong khi cùng Nhi làm bánh. Câu hỏi ngây thơ của Nhi, nếu người lớn không giải quyết vấn đề, liệu họ còn tốt không? Khiến Diệp đau lòng, cho thấy người lớn thường mang nỗi buồn lâu hơn và giấu nó sau những thói quen. Cô mỉm cười với Nhi, nhưng sự vắng lặng của Jame biến sự im lặng trong bếp thành áp lực. Sau đó, Jame đến thăm Phát để cảm ơn vì đã giúp đỡ mẹ của Phát, rồi thú nhận rằng anh đang giằng xé. Việc thu thập bằng chứng có thể khiến cha anh phải vào tù. Jame cảnh báo rằng cha anh đang nhắm vào công ty của Diệp và yêu cầu Phát theo dõi ông ta, ngăn chặn mọi hành động và âm thầm cảnh báo Diệp. Jame giữ khoảng cách, tin rằng khoảng cách an toàn hơn là kéo Diệp vào vòng xoáy rắc rối. Anh muốn có câu trả lời từ cha mình, nhưng lòng trung thành khiến anh vẫn mắc kẹt. Khi Phát đang gánh chịu gánh nặng, một tin nhắn đến: "Đừng đóng vai anh hùng."